But let's start with the Biden and Xi Jinping meeting. It was a year in the making. After tensions on a series of issues, the US President Joe Biden and the Chinese President Xi Jinping met this last week at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco. This was their first face-to-face encounter since Beijing severed ties over Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August 2022. And that's why all eyes were on the meeting between the two leaders. It was, well, amicable enough. Both leaders agreed to re-establish military channels of communication and enhance counter-narcotics cooperation. This signaled a rare moment of cooperation between the two superpowers. Remember, the US and China have been at odds on trade, on cyber security, on maritime security, on human rights, and a number of other issues. But despite efforts to minimize the friction in this meeting, Biden did end up making a rather interesting comment post the meeting. Although, quite frankly, he was pushed to it by a journalist asking him a question. He reiterated that he viewed Xi as a dictator. And naturally, China was not too happy with that. So, what was actually achieved in the meeting? Do the agreements indicate a thaw in relations? And if so, how long will it last? Most importantly, what does this actually mean for India? But hey, let's put some of these questions to the experts in the field. It's great to now be joined by Philippe Lecour, who's a senior fellow on foreign policy at the Center for China Analysis. We're also being joined by Gurjeet Singh, a former ambassador of India to Germany, to Indonesia, and to many other countries as well. Thank you both for joining us. Philippe Lecour, let me just start with you. What do you make of the actual meeting that we've just had? I mean, is it a major landmark event, or is it just good that they are talking?
So Vikram, I think the fact they didn't have a final statement speaks volumes. But the fact that they sat down around the table is also a positive one after many months of bitter relations and counting. In a way, the comment by President Biden during the press conference that Chairman Xi Jinping was a dictator reflects the fact that, on one hand, it hasn't really changed in the U.S. view. I mean, the view of China in the U.S., in the Biden administration has not really changed. On the other hand, the fact that they are meeting indeed should be seen as progress. And the fact that there are at least, 3 points where they have made progress. One of them is about the drugs, the fentanyl, having a conversation on this. The second one being climate, and the third one I can't remember. But
third one was military. Third one was military.
Yes. All right. Yes, going back to having military conversations. Well, the thing is, there are incidents almost daily, in the South China Sea. So it's good to have a communication line, some kind of hotline. But the problem is, it's about time, really. I mean, we're facing a very dangerous situation, particularly in the South China Sea.
All right, Philippe, so nothing concrete seems to have come of that. But the fact that they are talking at all, the fact that they met and there were handshakes of some sort, the fact that Chinese social media stopped bashing the United States at least for a week or so. Do you think, is there some slight rethinking, especially on the Chinese side?
Yeah, that's correct. I think, the message, as you know, you have to read Chinese politics from the inside. That's the only way. So the reason why Xi Jinping made the trip to San Francisco, although he would have made the trip anyway, because this is APEC, this is the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. It's very rare for a Chinese leader or for any leader of these countries not to attend. It's an economic and trade, conference that takes place every 2 years in different countries. But I think, he wanted to make a point that he's going there to San Francisco, and he's not just attending APEC, he's also meeting the US president on a bilateral basis for the first time in 12 months. And the US president gives face to the Chinese leader by, there were comments in the Chinese media about the warm welcome by the US government and the fact that they were hosted in a separate venue, and obviously it wasn't like a side meeting. It was a proper bilateral summit between the two leaders of two major powers. So I think, from the Chinese point of view, they were satisfied with the fact, I think they're obsessed with the face, the issue, which is nothing new, but Xi Jinping himself wants to be respected, wants to be taken seriously, and he wants the Chinese people to understand that, because that's been his narrative for the past 11 years now.
All right, Ambassador Singh, let me turn to you next, and let me get the Indian perspective on some of this. Yes, there was a warm enough welcome, I guess, that's what the Chinese are calling it. Of course, from an Indian point of view, you would contrast that with the state visit that Prime Minister Modi just held there, which was a really, really warm reception. But from an Indian point of view, would we also be thinking about the fact that Xi Jinping did go for the APEC meeting, but he did not come for G20? He did not come to New Delhi for the G20. So is there a message that China is trying to send in all of this?
Thank you. I agree with what Professor said on most things. Now, you asked about the G20. Normally, the Chinese president attends the G20 and APEC. He does not attend the East Asia Summit, which the Chinese premier does. So this year too, the Chinese premier attended East Asia Summit and promptly came to Delhi for G20. So was that a slight to India? I don't think India felt slighted, but Biden did not lose that opportunity to even meet with the new Chinese premier. So that goes along with what Professor said, that the Americans have been rather keen to engage with China. But I think the Chinese are equally keen to engage, but they want to be seen to be wooed rather than, engage cooperatively. So where India is concerned, I think, the cooperative relationship between the US and China on macro issues of public good is good for us. But if the rivalry is taken away, particularly sanctions on technology by the US are removed, then, these China plus one benefits which India is deriving by getting, new FDI coming to us, that will be impacted. Secondly, if the Americans decide that the Indo-Pacific is going to be a zone of peace to make up with China, then that also troubles us.
Philippe, if I can just come back to you, I guess the question that many in India would be having looking at all of this, that, look, I think everyone would say it's great that they're not actually going to have a shooting war because World War III is not in anybody's interest. But there'd also be questions and perhaps some concerns in India that, is this a reset button that is going to be pressed? And are we going to go back to the days when the West was putting all of its economic eggs, in particular, in the Chinese basket? So that's sort of a strategic reset of some sort. Do you think there's any chance of that actually happening, any possibility of that happening?
Well, somebody was writing an opinion piece about the end of the best, of the most successful joint venture between the United States and China for the past 30 or 40 years with Chinese open door policy, which certainly helped multinationals to develop and please their investors. But we have come to a more down-to-earth realization that China is not just an economic power, but also a political one, a military one, and technological one. So this is something that the world has to address, and certainly in terms of military, as I pointed out earlier, there are a number of issues in Indo-Pacific, which are very, very worrying. One of them being the Taiwan Strait. One of them is the South China Sea, which I mentioned earlier, with many incidents. I mean, if you ask to our friends from the Philippines, for example, but also, the Sino-Indian border. So there are many places where, the Indo-Pacific has become, despite the fact, there's a war in Ukraine, there's a war in the Middle East, there are so many issues, geopolitical issues going on. A number of things are still making the Indo-Pacific the center of geopolitical attention, if not tension. And therefore, it is very important that the relationship is maintained between big powers, and not only between the United States and China, but also between Europe and China, and between India and China. So at least the line should be open, but whether we'll find a conclusion and whether China will switch to a different policy, I'm not holding my breath for this in the next few years.
Philippe Lecour, Ambassador Gurjit Singh, thank you both so much for being with us on This World.